Hi everyone, welcome to this PowerPoint on clear cutting and sustainable forestry. We're going to be talking about two learning objectives today. They're pretty much contrasting learning objectives. Topic 5.2, which is clear cutting, and topic 5.17, which is sustainable forestry. And you can obviously see how they are related to one another. The enduring understanding for the first is that humans use natural resources, they alter the natural system. And we're going to be describing the effects that clear cutting has on those natural systems, specifically forests. And for topic 5.17, humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use and describe methods of mitigating human impacts on forests. The vocab is listed here, but I'm going to skip it. And if we were in class, we would do this think, pair, share, but pause this right now and think about some of the ecosystem services provided by forests. We've already gone through many of these, so you should be able to recall some. Now that you've had a moment to think about that, let's talk about those ecosystem services provided by forests. First off, about a third of Earth's land surface is covered by forest. Much of that is boreal forest in the northern hemisphere, as well as large swaths of tropical rainforest, the largest of which is the Amazon rainforest. And then you have temperate deciduous forests and tropical dry forests as well. A lot of Earth's surface is covered by forest. Not as much as sometimes in the past, but still a lot. So they are very, very important. And they play an outsized role in many of the biogeochemical cycles, specifically the carbon cycle. Trees obviously have more biomass per individual than grasses do. So there is more biomass and therefore more carbon compounds in that tree than there is in an individual grass. So photosynthesis obviously is going to lead to vegetation being a carbon sink. That vegetation lives and is a carbon sink, and then that dead vegetation is also a carbon sink. You have all that carbon that's locked in organic molecules in the dead vegetation until it decomposes. And then you also have humus and soil carbon. All right, the hydrologic cycle. Sorry, the bell just rang. The hydrologic cycle, a couple of the more important things, transpiration. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but transpiration, okay? Recall that transpiration is water that's evaporating directly from the stomata or the pores in leaves of plants, and that water can lead to cloud formation. In fact, it's estimated that about a third to a half of all the cloud formation in the Amazon rainforest is due to transpiration alone, not brought in from evaporation from over the oceans, but transpiration alone. And it also creates cooling in that local area. Remember that whenever water evaporates, whether it's transpiration or just evaporation, combined that would be evapotranspiration. Whenever water evaporates, it cools that surface that it's evaporating from. So there's a cooling effect from transpiration as well. Tree roots and the understory plants in the forest help reduce runoff and increase the percolation of groundwater into the soil. We talked about this with watersheds and why mountain forests upslope of agricultural land or upslope of cities is extremely important for providing a constant supply of water for those human activities or infrastructure. And then forest soils filter water as well. And then for nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, they obviously cycle those nutrients, but it's not as big of a player here as the carbon and hydrologic cycles. Some other ecosystem services, there is some overlap here. So soil formation and retention, they filter pollutants out of the air and water. So trees will filter pollutants out of the air through the process of photosynthesis, and then some other biochemical pathways that we don't really have to get into, but they also filter pollutants out of water in the soils. Okay, they can recharge the groundwater, so again, that infiltration. They provide habitat for all the organisms in the forest, all the different species. Primary productivity is huge, and they moderate the local climate. Again, there's the shade, they moderate the albedo, they reflect some sunlight, opposed to dark soil, which would absorb more sunlight. And then, although trees do absorb a lot of sunlight, and they only have a very moderate albedo, they just reflect a little bit of sunlight. And then there's the transpiration I talked about on the last slide. This shade component is huge, and I've seen that come up on a few FRQs, especially if one of them that we talked about in class, where you might have a river and you clear cut all of the trees that overhang this river and shade this river. So you remove those and that shade is no longer cooling that river and that river heats up. In fact, I have that on the next slide as well. Well, I guess I didn't have it on this slide. It's coming up on a different slide. Anyway, some provisioning services. Timber, obviously, we get a lot of wood from forests. That's our primary place where we get wood from. Farming. We can farm in forests. So there are certain crops that are shade tolerant that actually grow better underneath of the canopy of other plants, other trees than they do in full sun. Coffee is a great example of that. So we have shade grown coffee on the left and sun coffee on the right. If we grow the same variety of coffee in both shade and then exposed to full sun, the shade grown coffee typically produces more because coffee is an understory plant. It's a mid canopy plant and it evolved to grow in the shade. So it's actually better to grow coffee or vanilla or chocolate under the shade of other trees than it is out in full sun. So replacing a monoculture like we see on the left or on the right, sorry, with a more diverse community that can provide some natural habitat on the left. We can do silvopasture. This is really an underrated thing that forests can provide, and it's really for somewhat specific forests. A dense tropical rainforest is more difficult to do silvopasture in than a temperate deciduous forest with a lot of open ground for grasses, but we can still do some silvopasture, which is just grazing in the forest. Okay, there's obviously a lot of wild caught food sources, so we can forage for mushrooms or berries, we can hunt, and we can fish in forests. And then the potential pharmaceuticals is a major one. So there is a lot of pharmaceuticals. Most of our pharmaceuticals, in fact, are based off of naturally occurring compounds in plants or fungi, or even some bacteria. There are many, many, many plants that modern science has not yet tested that are known to indigenous communities to have pharmaceutical effects. And if we just clear cut through the entire forest, we may lose those species and those potential pharmaceuticals. Okay. And all this brings us to deforestation. So we first talked about why forests are important. Now let's talk about what we are doing to forests. Deforestation. This is the removal of forest and converting that land to any non-forest use. That could be farmland or pasture. It could be development. It could be mining or anything else. Okay. Clear cutting is slightly different from deforestation. They are two different and distinct terms. Clear cutting is cutting down all the trees, just all the stems in the forest. We will often do that just for timber extraction, and then we'll let the forest regrow and then do it again. But it can also be used to convert that forest into other forms. So deforestation is often accomplished through clear cutting, but clear cutting does not necessarily imply that deforestation is occurring. Okay, we have to look at the setting or the context of that activity. Okay. So these are some pictures of clear cutting. Obviously, we have on the left an aerial view and then on the right two ground level views of clear cutting. All of these look as though they're from boreal forests. Okay. It's again literally just chopping down every tree, and as you go through that entire process, you create all this debris on the ground that smothers all of the understory plants often it does. Now, clear cutting is an umbrella term that encompasses many types of clear cutting. You don't need to know all these. What you need to know are standard clear cutting and slash and burn, the two that are in bold. But I'm going to go through the rest of them because I think that awareness of the different techniques that are out there can help you out understand this entire concept. So standard clear cutting is just removing every tree. Okay, it's what we saw on the previous slides where you just remove every tree and you just go through the forest and get rid of all the trees. Okay. Patch clear cutting, though, that's removal of the trees in just a certain area. Say that we have one patch that we clear cut, another patch that we leave open, or sorry, unclear cut, not open, but a closed canopy, and then another patch that we clear cut, and then another patch that's intact forest. So we can remove certain patches of forest for extraction of materials in a really cognizant way, or a way that is intentional. Okay, based off of certain characteristics. We can do strip clear cutting. This is removing all the trees in a strip that's perpendicular to the prevailing winds. So let's say that the prevailing winds are coming out of the west and we have our forest here. We can remove a strip of forest, and then a strip of forest, and then a strip of forest, perpendicular to the prevailing winds. And what that essentially does is create windbreaks so that all of the soil that's in these patches that has been clear cut is protected by the wind from the trees that are remaining in this area, and that soil doesn't blow away. It mitigates the erosion effects of the wind on that soil. Okay, so a little bit more environmentally friendly than just standard clear cutting. You would typically do this in a tree farm. You would typically say that you plant trees here that are 5 years old, or maybe 15 years old, and then the trees that you harvest are 30 years old. So you would stagger where you harvest with where you plant, and then these tree breaks, you would plant those again, and new trees, the area that you just clear cut, they would grow up, and then another 15 years you would harvest the current windbreaks using, and then the new trees in the old clear cut zone would be the new windbreaks. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. That was a really poor explanation. Clear cutting with reserves, that's where you're removing most of the trees, but you're leaving some left for a certain specific reason. Maybe those are a value food source, so maybe they provide nuts that you can eat. Maybe you'll leave some trees for your cattle to get some shade under. Maybe you'll leave a couple trees because you're forbidden for cutting them down for whatever reason. Maybe it's like an endangered species or a threatened tree, or it's like the national tree of your country, whatever it is. Maybe there's some symbolic or cultural reason for that, for leaving that one tree or one type of tree. And then seed cutting, this is removing the majority of the trees, but leaving some left to reseed the forest. Okay. Then we get to slash and burn. Slash and burn is a little bit misunderstood because nowadays it's used pretty much in an unsustainable fashion. This is where you convert your forest to agricultural land. In the past, when human populations were low and we weren't encroaching on forests as much as we are at the rate that we are today, slash and burn was a little bit more sustainable. Essentially what you do is, let's say that you have a large area that is forested. You will cut down a certain plot. You will cut down all the trees in that area, use them for whatever purpose you can use that tree for, and then you would burn the rest. Remember that burning wood releases a lot of the nutrients that are in that wood into the soil. So the phosphates, the nitrates in that wood into the soil. In fact, potash or potash is potassium that you get from ash. Okay, it's a really good potassium source. So you would then farm that area, leaving the rest of this as forest. You would farm it for a few years until you deplete that soil, and then you would move on to the next patch of forest. You would clear cut it and slash and burn it, and then allow this previous patch to start to revegetate. So it would start to go through the stages of succession and revegetate. And then you would go to the next patch, and then the next patch, etc., working through these patches of forest until you get back to the original one, maybe 15, 20, 30, 100 years later. And you would go in the cyclical manner and not use a very large amount of forest. Now, the problem nowadays is that slash and burn is no longer applied in the cyclical manner. Instead, what we're doing is just marching in a linear fashion through the forest and burning as we go. Okay, because there's so many people and we need so much land to feed the growing human population, especially since so much of the human population is transitioning to a more meat-heavy diet. So we need more land to feed all of those people. Okay. All right, so some negative impacts of clear cutting. Obviously, we're going to negate all of the ecosystem services that forests provide. We lose our habitat and we lose our biodiversity first. Okay, we will pretty much immediately increase our water runoff and soil erosion through both water and wind. Even though some of those methods that I described on the previous slide mitigate that erosion, you still have that erosion because the trees are no longer there holding the soil. Okay, so the soil dries out and it can erode via water and wind because you no longer have roots holding that soil together. Okay, you increase the atmospheric carbon, especially if you were burning that area. But as we saw with the termite FRQ, even the decomposition of all that plant matter is going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So decomposition, combustion and aerobic decomposition rather, is going to release CO2. Anaerobic decomposition is going to release CH4 or CO2, depending on the pathway present. But we're typically going to be talking about CH4 being released by methanogenic bacteria. And again, decomposition releases CO2 or CH4, but the carbon content of the soil is going to decrease as well. So that humus is going to be exposed to the air and it's going to decompose as well. Plus you have all the machinery that burns fossil fuels that is used to accomplish deforestation or accomplish clear cutting, and that all releases pollutants as well, including carbon dioxide. Okay, we lose a food source for both humans and animals if the forest is no longer there. If that habitat is no longer there, you can no longer hunt in that area. Okay, reduction of tourism. You increase the temperature of soil, the rivers, and all that from the loss of shade. So that's what I was talking about on that previous slide where I had the diagram of the river. If there's trees overhanging that river, you cut down all the trees, that river temperature is going to increase, perhaps out of the range of tolerance of some of those organisms in that river. So continuing on with runoff and erosion. So runoff and erosion are going to become huge in this unit. So because they're increasing, because erosion is increasing and runoff is increasing, all of that water that is running off of the surface and eroding the soil with it is going to carry that soil, that sediment, into your local waterways. It also is going to carry anything that's in that soil to your local waterways as well, including dissolved chemicals such as heavy metals or pesticides or nutrients. Okay, that's going to increase, or just the sediment alone is going to increase the turbidity of that water. And recall that turbidity is the measurement of suspended solids in a water column. That's going to decrease the clarity of your river, which is going to decrease your primary productivity in that waterway, which is going to impact the food web. It also decreases the albedo. So that means that more sunlight is going to be absorbed by that river or whatever waterway it is, and it's going to increase in temperature in addition to the loss of shade that the trees are providing. The nutrients that are going into the river, the sediment and the nutrients really, but if we're talking about sediments being soil, soil contains nutrients, but we're also talking about the minerals, nutrients and fertilizers that are going into your waterway, that's going to lead to eutrophication. And we've talked about that so many times before that I'm not going to redefine it here. You can change your water chemistry, so the water pH being part of that, but also the nutrient load and everything else in the water. We'll talk about dissolved oxygen a little bit later on when we talk about water pollution, but it's going to decrease the dissolved oxygen in that waterway as well, especially due to eutrophication. And all of that is going to reduce in loss of habitat and biodiversity in that ocean. And then all of those rivers are going to lead to the ocean. Sorry, I think I said ocean earlier, but all the rivers are going to lead to the ocean, and they're going to cause these same effects in the ocean, leading to oceanic dead zones. Okay, and then if we're talking about mangroves specifically, mangroves buffer storm surges, so we're going to lose that buffering effect of the mangroves. All right, some other impacts. Because we're clear cutting, that's implying that humans are penetrating deeper into these forests. That's going to lead to further habitat fragmentation and increased edge effect in those forests. This one is a big one, introduction of invasive species to that forest where it's been clear cut. Okay, so because humans are moving into that area, we are taking species with us, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Even a fungus like chytrid fungus that can survive on the soles of your boots. You walk into an intact forest, walk through a creek, and then all of a sudden you've introduced chytrid fungus into that creek, and the amphibians in that creek can suffer from it. Zoonotic diseases, also big. What I'm showing up here on this diagram, we'll talk for an entire couple days about zoonotic diseases, but those are diseases that jump from animal hosts to humans. So humans are not the primary host of these diseases, but because we're now in contact with these animals, because we penetrated deeper into the forest, we are getting these diseases. Okay, HIV is a great example. Ebola is a great example of these diseases. And then we can displace indigenous groups of people that were already in the forest. The Amazon is a great case study for that. So if we have all these negative effects for clear cutting, then why do we do it? Well, not surprisingly, the answer is short-term economic benefit. Okay, you're getting money from it. You're getting money either from your lumber or the fuel wood or charcoal that you can sell. You're getting money from raising cattle or soy or corn or palm oil in that area that was previously forest. All of this is just due to economics. Okay, even if like just the most basic idea of you have to have fuel wood to eat to cook your food because you don't have electricity, that is still that's another reason. Okay, but primarily it's economic. So just some figures about deforestation. At the present rate of deforestation, we're losing about 28 million hectares of forest a year. That is a lot of area. That's equivalent to about one football field every second. So if you think about just eliminating one football field every single second and how many seconds there are in a year, that is a lot of land every year. Okay, those current rates continue. All the world's forests are going to be lost in 100 years or less. And then the stats that I can find from this source were from 2018. And then we're looking at the highest loss of primary forest. Not surprisingly, Brazil is the highest one. And then a very distant second, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then Indonesia, Colombia, and Bolivia. Okay. Notice that 3 of the top 5 are in South America, the Amazon rainforest and the other rainforests around the Amazon, and then Africa, the Congo rainforest, and Indonesia. So since Brazil is losing the most forest around the world, let's look a little bit closer at Brazil. Now, Brazil is a very large country. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that it's losing so much forest, right? You can have the same rate of forest loss in Colombia and Bolivia, but because Brazil is just so much larger, you're losing more land area at the same rate. Okay, it's actually the world's 5th largest country by land area. Okay. Um, so since 1970, about 700,000 square kilometers or 270,000 square miles of forest have been converted to other uses. So basically an area the size of Texas have been converted to other uses. That is primarily agricultural. Of that agriculture, it is for ranching, primarily cattle, but some sheep and some goat. And then for plants, we're talking mostly about soy and corn. Okay, but those are the 3 largest um, agricultural uses. Okay, Brazil doesn't just have the Amazon rainforest. Okay, obviously the Amazon rainforest exists in the Amazon River Basin. There is a couple other rainforests that are less well known in South America, including in Brazil. But there's also the Atlantic forest. The Atlantic forest is a very unique forest that is biodiversity, and in the biodiversity sense, it's very different from the Amazon rainforest. The plants and animals that exist in the Atlantic forest are very different from those in the Amazon rainforest. Okay, only about 8 to 14% of that forest remains. And the reason for that is because if I get rid of my markings, the Atlantic forest is where most of Brazil's largest cities are. It's very difficult to read on this map, but most of Brazil's large cities are on the Atlantic coast. Okay, so not only are we losing that Atlantic forest for agricultural use, but we're also losing it for development. Okay, the Amazon rainforest though is huge. About 80% of it still remains, but it is under threat. So as people march further and further into the Amazon from every direction, we lose more and more of it every year. But it is a very, very, very large forest. Much of it still remains intact. Okay, so let's Contrast all of this clear cutting with sustainable forestry. So recall that unsustainable use is using a natural resource at a rate greater than the rate that it can be replenished, whereas sustainable use is using that resource at a rate at or below the rate at which it is replenished. Okay, and then if we break down the second part of this term, forestry, forestry is the science, the practice, the art of maintaining forests and woodlands. Okay, it's basically managing forests. That could include planting, harvesting timber, conserving the forest. It could be using the forest for other non-wood means. It's really using the forest for any reason, and there is sustainable forestry, and then there's unsustainable forestry. And clear cutting is an example of unsustainable forestry. Some methods of sustainable forestry though. Timber is a renewable resource if you manage it properly. So if you manage your forest properly, timber is renewable, right? It grows, right? All you have to do is reseed it. It might take 20, 50, 100 years for you to harvest that tree that you seed, but your grandkids at least can harvest it. One method of sustainable forestry is selective cutting. Okay, selective cutting is harvesting trees based on preordained conditions. That could be that you reach a tree of a certain size. It could be that you're only cutting trees of a certain age. It could be that you're only cutting diseased trees. It could be that you're only cutting trees that are windfall, or harvesting trees that are windfall, so trees that are blown over in storms due to the wind, or trees that are uprooted for any other reason. Okay, a lot of the forests in the United States are starting to only be used for, especially the hardwood forests. I should say that the hardwood forests, the oak, maple, the walnut, the birch, all of that is typically selectively cut in the United States now. You won't clear cut cherry because there's not enough cherry in a forest to clear cut it, but you can selectively cut it. And you would typically do that based off of these characteristics, and the most sustainable way would be to harvest windfall, diseased, or uprooted trees, trees that are going to die anyway. Okay. You can only buy from sustainable certified programs. So if you are buying wood, or if you're buying any other forest product, if you're buying anything that is grown in the tropical regions like palm oil or coconut or pineapples or anything coffee, you can look for some of these symbols. One of those is Rainforest Alliance, so you can look for the little frog symbol. One of them, if you're just going for wood, is the Forest Stewardship Council. Okay. Reusing wood is a great way to not cut any more wood, so you're reusing the wood that's already been cut. Prohibiting logging in ecologically sensitive or highly diverse areas. Okay, so just if there's a lot of biodiversity in an area, just prohibit logging there. Okay, this would be an example of legislation. Reforestation or afforestation. We'll talk about those on the next couple slides, but reforestation, this part re, is saying that there was forest there previously, it has been clear cut, it's been otherwise disturbed, and you are reforesting that area. You're converting it back into forest. Afforestation, you're looking at a different root word. That's essentially saying that you're taking a biome that was previously not forest, and now you're converting it to forest. So you're planting forest where there previously was not forest before. We'll talk about IPM, or integrated pest management, on another day. We have an entire day for IPM, but part of this is going back to the selective cutting. You're removing diseased trees. Okay, but we'll talk about IPM on another day. And we've already talked about prescribed burns when we talked about wildfires in Colorado, so I'm not really going to spend much time on that. So we looked at Brazil for a negative. Let's look at China for a positive. China is currently doing, and has been for a while, the largest afforestation project in the world. It's called their 3 North Shelter Forest Program, but most people just refer to it as the Great Green Wall. The goal of this was to stop the encroachment of the Gobi Desert in northern China. And so far, about 500,000 square kilometers of forest have been planted in an area that was previously not forest. That's making it the world's largest artificial forest. Now, there is a lot of problems and a lot of criticisms with this. The labor used is often not voluntary, it's often conscripted. there's ecological problems beyond just the humanitarian problems. Those ecological problems is that many of these forests are monocultures. They're trees that grow very rapidly and then die, possibly before reseeding themselves in this area that they're not native to. There's high tree mortality rates. Some of the places have up to 70% tree mortality rates. So 7 out of every 10 trees that you plant dies. And then there's the depletion of groundwater to water all of these trees. You notice the water lines. All of these lines are drip hoses to water these trees. They're obviously trying to plant trees in desert where trees typically don't grow. So you have to give them a lot of water. That water has to come from somewhere, and you don't have many rivers in the desert, so it's coming from groundwater. But this is still a great example of afforestation. And it is stopping the encroachment of the Gobi. The encroachment of the Gobi is basically due to the wind coming off of the Gobi and eroding the soil at the edge of the desert, creating more desert, and then eroding the next layer of, or the next set of soil, the next soil boundary at the edge of that new desert, creating more desert, etc. So putting trees there effectively holds that soil in place and stops that erosion. Okay, we've already talked about prescribed burns in a lot of detail when we talked about fire in Colorado, so I'm going to skip this slide, but if you want a refresher, you can pause it and read through it now. And the same thing with this slide. In fact, these slides are basically copied and pasted from what we talked about back in September. However, I wanted to have them on there because they are an example of sustainable forestry and they are specifically in the learning objectives. So let's get to the learning objectives, rather the essential knowledge. For clear cutting, we talked about how clear cutting is economically advantageous. That is typically in the short term, because once you have clear cut that area, you don't have any more trees to cut down or to sell. You have to wait for them to regrow if you replant it. Okay, so short-term economic benefits. But it does have many problems that it causes. Soil erosion, increased soil increased soil and stream temperatures, flooding, all of the stuff that we've talked about. Okay. Forests contain trees that absorb pollutants and store carbon dioxide. When you cut them down, you release those pollutants. Well, you don't release those pollutants. Sorry, that's wrong. You just release the carbon dioxide. The pollutants are typically fixed in biological tissue, and then they're converted to some other form. Okay, so like sulfates in the soil will be converted into proteins that have sulfur in them. Okay, so it's totally getting rid of the pollutant, not getting rid of, but chemically converting that pollutant. But the carbon dioxide, though, carbon dioxide is absorbed from the atmosphere, locked in the biomass of the plants, and then when you cut them down, you release that carbon dioxide through the process of decomposition or combustion. Okay. And then over to the sustainable forestry, the essential knowledge. Some of the methods of mitigating deforestation include reforestation, using and buying wood harvested by ecologically sustainable forestry techniques, and reusing wood. With reforestation, I would include afforestation in there as well. Okay. Methods to protect forests from pathogens and insects include IPM. Again, we'll talk about this on another day. But you also have the selective removal of affected trees. Okay, so like we talked about when we talked about the American chestnut, if you see affected trees, you can cut them down so that they don't spread to other trees. Now that was a failed technique with the American chestnut. It didn't halt the spread of chestnut blight, but it is still a technique that has worked in other situations. And then prescribed burning is another way that forests can be managed and that they can be managed sustainably. Okay, so hope you guys found this interesting. Hope you learned something. I'll see you on class. Bye.